If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge. From worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Hello and welcome to episode 262 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to say thanks to some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Angie, Rachel M, Erin N, Sandra G, and 3 Opossum Moon. Thank you so much for subscribing to the Patreon. I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is The Wolf of Snow Hollow. The Wolf of Snow Hollow was released in 2020. It has 6.2 out of 10 on IMDb and 90% on Rotten Tomatoes. Terror grips a small mountain town as bodies are discovered after each full moon. Losing sleep, raising a teenage daughter, and caring for his ailing father, Officer Marshall struggles to remind himself that there's no such thing as werewolves. Oh, this film was such a surprise. It was such a pleasant surprise. I knew nothing about it, didn't know anything about Jim Cummings, who wrote it and starred in it, didn't know what to expect from it. And you know what? I was really pleased that I watched it. I was pleasantly surprised. So we're going to break down the likes first, right? I think this is going to be quite a short review actually, because I've kind of very little negative to say about it. And I generally talk more when I've got a lot of negative things to say, because I'm nothing if not a negative Nelly. I love a werewolf movie, right? You guys know this. I love a werewolf movie. I was recently very disappointed by Wolfman. I went to see it, didn't like it, and I was a bit like, we need some sort of redeeming werewolf movie stuff going on here, okay? And this film did feel like a redeeming moment. I like a horror film that has its roots in the human condition, right? I want a horror film where you look at the characters and you go, oh, you are imperfect and you are a difficult person and you are nuanced and you make weird decisions and you're behaving in a way that maybe I wouldn't necessarily behave in. However, you can see that they're behaving like that because they are human, they are struggling, they are making mistakes, and human beings aren't black and white, right? That's good writing, in my opinion. And this film was full of that. It was full of people who were nuanced, who were products of their environment, who were reflective of their environment, and it was really interesting to watch. And I really liked the script. It was funny and really silly at times. Like, there were moments in it where it felt like you were watching this really absurd situation play out and you were like, what is happening? But I do think that it was a genuinely good exploration of toxic masculinity and misogyny. And I think it was a really good exploration of how toxic masculinity, misogyny and the patriarchy ultimately harm men as well. Okay, so it's not just about like, you know, how it harms women. That's an element of it. But it is also about how these elements create expectations for men that are often not sustainable and how that impacts men in their day-to-day life. And I'm trying not to say too much because I don't want to give too much away, but there are several moments throughout the film where you end up being like, shit, is this actually a werewolf? Or is this something else? Or is this a person? Or is it something else entirely? Do you know? And that's, I think that's a sign of good writing, that you're constantly flip-flopping between believing, no, it has to be a werewolf, and then thinking, oh shit, no, it must be a person, you know? And I also did a lot of reading about this afterwards. I was reading a lot of Reddit forums and various reviews about this film. And a lot of people said that this film gives a really good portrayal of what it's like to live with addiction. So the main character is an alcoholic, and he is in AA trying to get sober. And I'm not somebody who has had an alcohol addiction, but apparently it is a really good portrayal of what alcohol addiction can be like for people. So I thought that was interesting, that it was sensitive to that rather than it just being like, you know, another plot point about this man where it's like, oh, everything's falling apart for him and he's an alcoholic. That actually it demonstrated how much it impacts his day-to-day life. Even when he is sober, even when he's not actively drinking, it still impacts his day-to-day life. And in terms of dislikes, I actually don't really have that many. There was very little that I properly disliked about this film. I felt like there were issues with the timeline. You know, there were a number of times when I was watching it that I was like, who? Wait, what? When did this happen? Where are we? How much time has passed? And I do remember thinking at various points, geez, this full moon is going on for a long time. Like, how long does a full moon last? Because this feels like it's been going on for about 6 weeks. And then I don't really know if they had considered the way in which the time was passing, because it felt like this was happening sequentially over a number of days. But I think the implication was that it was happening over a number of months, and I don't think that was very clear. I don't think that was very clear at all. And there were various points where people, you know, died, and I was like, what? Who's that? When did that happen? Whose funeral are we at now? I'm really confused. So I don't know if it was to do with editing or an element of storytelling that I just didn't get or I didn't understand. But I do think there were issues with the timeline. And I don't know visually if the reveal at the end worked. And I was a bit like, really? Oh, I can't say much more than that because I don't want to give too much away. But there were elements of what we see throughout the film and what we see at the end that potentially didn't match up. And I found that initially I wasn't annoyed by it, but then the more I thought about it, the more I got annoyed by it. You know what I mean? And this film, like, it's not much of a horror in terms of scares. Like, it's not a paranormal, supernatural horror film in that way. There are definitely scary moments in it. It's a fun creature feature in ways, but it is a comedy horror. So think like Shaun of the Dead, but maybe darker. You know, Shaun of the Dead that explores negative facets of the human condition in a more robust way. So if you're looking for like a Dog Soldiers-esque kind of horror werewolf film where you're like, oh my God, there are werewolves and they're all being hunted in a cabin in the woods, this is not it for you. But if you like a horror film that has a comedy bent but is also geared towards the human condition, then this one is for you. Definitely go and check it out. And I kind of appreciated it more that Jim Cummings, the guy who wrote it and starred in it and directed it, I think too, I actually don't know, I can't remember, but this is his passion project. It was his baby, and he was writing about it on Reddit and said that he had put like his life, his heart and soul into making this film. And I do think the passion and the love for the film came across, and I thought the performances were really good. I thought it was an interesting take on toxic masculinity and misogyny and how it impacts men, not just women. And I enjoyed it. What a little find. What a little gem. I'm going to give this film 4 out of 5 stars. I think the timeline issues are the thing that annoyed me about this film. Everything else I was pretty on board with, you know. It was also really funny. Like, it really made me laugh out loud at times. So, you know, I was into it. And I've been recommending it to people. So, you know, 4 out of 5 for The Wolf of Snow Hollow.
If you're a maintenance supervisor for a commercial property, you've had to deal with everything from leaky faucets to flickering light bulbs. But nothing's worse than that ancient boiler that's lived in the building since the day it was built, 50 years ago. It's enough to make anyone lose their cool. That's where Grainger comes in. With industrial-grade products and dependable fast delivery, Grainger can help with any challenge. From worn-out components to everyday necessities. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Renew your health and wellness purpose this new year with The Reset on Alo Moves, a curated weekly program of Pilates, strength, and step goals to kickstart your fitness journey. It's a 30-day week-by-week program 3 days of Pilates, 2 days of strength, and 8,000 daily steps, plus bonus nutrition tips from Sakara. Plus, for only $99, you get a year's worth of access to Alo Moves on-demand full studio experience wherever you are. Get moving today at alomoves.com.
Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
Hey, Prime members, are you tired of ads interfering with your favorite podcasts? Good news! With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts, included with your Prime membership. To start listening, download the Amazon Music app for free, or go to amazon.com/ad-free podcasts. That's amazon.com/ad-free podcasts to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Which brings us to our story this week. Now, our story this week is not about wolf men, but it is about toxic masculinity and misogyny and the man involved. I mean, could you describe him as wolf-like? Because a lot of people died because of him, you know? So I'm going to go with, actually, maybe it is connected. And if you are the person, there is a person who follows me, who has reached out to me before, who works at Hampton Court Palace. I believe they're a historian. If you are that person, can you please reach out to me again? Because I would love to interview you, and I cannot find our messages either in my emails or on Instagram. I cannot find them, but I know that you exist, and you know who you are because we've spoken before if you are hearing this. So let's dive into the stories of Hampton Court Palace. On the outskirts of London lies the historical seat of power of Tudor England. This unique red brick building is Hampton Court Palace, a castle the likes of which England had never seen before, and would yet to see again until the construction of the now famous Buckingham Palace, that would be completed centuries later. But unlike what you might expect, given that the castle is literally a palace, the grand rooms and large royal hall was not originally built for a king, but for a cardinal. Wanting to prove that he could keep up with the richest and most influential cardinals in Rome, in 1514, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey struck ground on what would become his incredibly impressive family home. He had the money to fund the project, and thanks to his close friendship with the then king, the infamous King Henry VIII, Cardinal Wolsey had the political power to pull off construction of the colossal building as well. Layer after layer of red Tudor brickwork was laid one on top of the other over the next decade, and inside, the palace was furnished with the best and most lavish furniture money could buy. But the Cardinal and his wife would only live at Hampton Court Palace for a few years before there was a drastic and catastrophic change in the wind. By then, Henry VIII was convinced that his marriage to the Spanish princess Catherine of Aragon wasn't going to produce a legitimate male heir for him to pass his kingdom over to after his death. He had instead set his eyes and his ambitions for the future of his kingdom on the young Anne Boleyn. By then, the two of them had courted for a long while, but Anne had managed to convince the king that he needed to divorce his wife and make Anne his queen instead. The demand was controversial. So controversial, in fact, that it would end up dividing not only the country, but the whole of Europe in two. There were those who supported Henry's first wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, and her already established right to the throne of England. And there were those who supported Anne Boleyn and her view on the reforms the churches should undergo in order to reduce Rome's influence over England. And then there were people like Cardinal Wolsey, who had to find a way to mediate what the king wanted and what Rome would allow. For years, King Henry VIII demanded that Cardinal Wolsey convince the Pope to annul his marriage with Catherine of Aragon so that he would be free to marry Anne. The Pope, however, was more loyal to Spain and their king, who just so happened to be Catherine's nephew. To say that the cardinal was stuck between a rock and a hard place would be the understatement of the century, and by 1529, Cardinal Wolsey could feel that his luck and the king's patience was beginning to run out. In an attempt to earn some favour with the growingly difficult Henry VIII, during a royal visit to Hampton Court Palace, the cardinal ended up gifting the king the whole thing. King Henry VIII graciously accepted the cardinal's generous offer and immediately brought in his teams of carpenters and builders to begin a mass expansion on the original building so that he could fit in all of his courtiers and servants. By 1530, just a year after gifting the king his own home, the cardinal was dead. But King Henry VIII continued construction work on his new and now favourite palace. He would add the massive Great Hall, the last medieval Great Hall to be built by the English monarchy. During Tudor England, it was the Great Halls that were the most important rooms in the whole palace. It was here that the lesser nobles and visiting courtiers could lay their eyes on the king, even if only from afar as he ate his big feasts up on a raised seat. And it was in these great halls that the kings and queens of Tudor England could show off their great wealth to visiting ambassadors and other nobles. It would take 5 years for Henry VIII's Great Hall to be complete, and so the story goes, the king was so impatient to use the room that he had the masons working 24/7 and by candlelight when the sun went down. And as Hampton Court Palace had become Henry's favourite palace to live in, it was the timeless witness to many important historic events for the period, some of which we will cover a bit later on in this episode. Through the years, the palace changed hands from monarch to monarch, and eventually it landed in the lap of Queen Victoria. Victorian Britain was a time of great change. With booming industry and an ever-expanding empire before them, the people found themselves drawn back to the past. It seemed everywhere you looked there was a new museum to visit, another mummy to unravel, and a new séance to attend. And Hampton Court Palace was no exception. With Queen Victoria firmly situated in her own iconic palace, Buckingham Palace, Hampton Court was mainly left unattended until 1838 when the Queen opened it to the public. The palace was an instant tourist success and attracted hundreds of visitors, all on the lookout for their next opportunity to brush up against the paranormal. On their way out from their chilling experiences, they could stop by the gift shop to purchase double-exposed postcards that supposedly provided proof that Hampton Court Palace was indeed haunted. We may be able to tell the difference between a real picture of the supernatural and a produced one today, but back then these postcards were a major hit. They helped cement the legacy of Hampton Court's spirited occupants. But is there actually any truth to the mysterious spectres who supposedly inspired the postcards themselves? To answer that question, we'll have to go back to take a look at some of those iconic moments in history that the palace stood witness to. It was 1537, just 2 years after the construction of Henry's Great Hall was finally completed. But the hallways and corridors of the court that day were eerily quiet. They shouldn't have been. The country and the known world at the time had just received news that Henry VIII had his long-awaited heir. In one of the upstairs bedrooms of the palace, Prince Edward had come bursting into the world, fulfilling his father's greatest desires by being a prince and not a princess, but fatally wounding his mother in the process. It was 2 weeks later that Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, and not his second wife, Anne Boleyn, would die from complications after the dramatic and violent birth. Henry and his country were devastated, and young Prince Edward was left without his mother. Only Jane is said to have returned to us. Every October on her son's birthday, a white wraith is rumoured to appear on one of the staircases leading up to the bedroom that Jane Seymour died in. To witnesses, the woman seems noticeably sad, and in her hand she carries a lighted taper as she heads up the stairs. No one knows where the spirit goes after that, but it's believed that she heads back into the bedroom where she welcomed her long-awaited son into the world, and where she departed it from. And as those of you who know your history already know, despite King Henry's heartbreak over the loss of his favourite wife, he would go on to have another, and another, and another. But it is Henry's fifth wife that seems to keep making return visits to the palace she once called home. It is now 1541. Henry lost his third wife, Jane Seymour, only 4 years before, and since then he's been married not once but twice. His fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, had the sense to give Henry what he wanted when he demanded a divorce, and quickly departed the palace with her head intact and her pockets lined. Henry's fifth wife, however, the teenage Catherine Howard, would not be so lucky. Cousin to his second wife, Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard was a young woman, full of life, full of energy, and now tied down to a significantly older husband. Henry had put on a terrific amount of weight. He suffered from gout and had to have a boil on his leg lanced every day. And thanks to a head injury he suffered earlier on in his life, he had grown quite the temper too. He found Catherine Howard's bubbly and extroverted personality exciting at first, but then the mood quickly soured. It was while she was in residence at Hampton Court that Catherine Howard found out that she was being charged with adultery. Despite her age and her inexperience, Catherine must have known that that charge was a veritable death sentence. Not only because to commit adultery against the king was considered an act of treason, but because it was the same crime her cousin Anne Boleyn had been executed for only a few years earlier. So the story goes. Upon hearing the news, Catherine Howard escaped from her guards to make a daring dash across the gallery towards the chapel where the king was at prayer. She cried and screamed all the way, begging the king for mercy. But she was captured before she managed to speak with the king in person. She was executed shortly after her last worldly attempt to speak with her husband. But her spirit seems damned to repeat the terrifying incident over and over again. Witnesses have reported not only hearing Catherine's screams along what is now called the Haunted Gallery, but to see her as well. Unlike Jane Seymour, who only seems to appear on the anniversary of her son's death, it's never quite certain when Catherine Howard will suddenly appear, screaming and running down the gallery, never to reach her mark. But that is not to say that she doesn't leave a lasting impression, even on those visitors who never get to see her ghostly face. One day in 1999, on 2 separate tours, 2 separate women fainted in exactly the same spot of the gallery. Perhaps Catherine saw in them a final opportunity to plead her innocence to the general public. Perhaps she saw in them the life she could have led if she hadn't been executed at the tender age of only 18. And perhaps she wanted to punish those women for what had been done to her. Perhaps those women were feeling the terror, the sorrow, the anger that Catherine felt before her death. She is now left to wander the corridors of Hampton Court, seeking justice that no one in this world can truly give to her. But as many wives as Henry VIII had, they made up only a fraction of the people living and breathing under the roof of Hampton Court Palace. Wherever he went, Henry brought with him a litany of other nobles, servants and tradesmen. And for his son, the young Prince Edward, Henry brought in the best wet nurse that money could buy. Sybil Penn was a noblewoman charged with keeping Henry VIII's long-awaited and only male heir alive. She would have had considerable power beyond the doors of the young boy's chambers, but she was also incredibly loyal to her cause. Under her care, was not only the future King of England, but, and of course she would have had no way of knowing at the time, she was also raising the next two Queens of England as well. Despite falling out of favour with the King, Anne Boleyn's daughter, Princess Elizabeth, was still raised at Hampton Court. She functioned somewhat as a princess, but also as a servant for her younger brother. But when Elizabeth was struck down with smallpox in 1562, she was very much treated like the princess she truly was. Sybil Penn dropped everything to take care of the ailing Elizabeth, which was a dangerous thing to do, as smallpox was a deadly disease at the time. And thanks to Sybil's care, Princess Elizabeth made a full recovery and went on to become the glorious Elizabeth I of England, but not before her disease could travel from her to her caretaker. Sybil contracted smallpox and she wasn't as lucky as her charge had been. She would die shortly after and was buried on the palace grounds, as all the most loyal servants were at the time. It was beside the Hampton church that Sybil rested peacefully for centuries until renovations on the church in 1829 woke her from her slumber. Since then, witnesses have seen a lady in grey walking through the apartments. Judging by her appearance, many believe that the grey lady is in fact Sybil Penn, back on duty and searching the corridors for the children she was tasked with looking after many, many years ago. And even in death, Sybil Penn is believed to be hard at work. For years, witnesses complained about hearing the sound of a spinning wheel, even though the palace was empty, and no one had been using a spinning wheel on the grounds for centuries. So the stories go, when construction work took down the wall that the sounds seemed to be coming from, a very old and very worn spinning wheel was found behind it. But Sybil Penn does not stand alone in terms of Hampton Court's nightly visitors who appeared over unfavourable feelings towards their final resting places. In 1871, construction work uncovered the skeletal remains under a cloister in Fountain Court. To most people, the discovery came as a surprise, but not to one inhabitant who shared a wall with the court itself. The woman who lived in that apartment had been complaining for years that someone was banging on her walls at night. No one listened, but when the bodies of these two men were discovered, the tenant couldn't help but make a statement to the press. "The stupid Board of Works," she said, "has at last found the two wretched men who have been haunting me for years." It is believed that the two remains belonged to the victims of the civil wars during 1642 to 1651, and since they have been properly interred, all sounds on apartment walls during the dead of night are said to have been stopped. But perhaps Hampton Court's most infamous paranormal resident comes from far more recent times. In 2003, CCTV footage captured a set of fire doors violently flinging open in the middle of the night. Guards were perplexed. There was no one out in the corridors and every member of their party was accounted for. They closed the doors and got back to duty. But the next night, the very same thing would happen again, only this time, the perpetrator would reveal himself. Dressed in a long, dark cloak, and his face melted away to only a skeleton, was a man. Both fire doors appeared to burst open at once, and a man appeared. He is only on the CCTV for a few seconds before he disappears from view. He appears to try and close the doors. The guards rushed to the scene, but no one was there, and there were no traces that anyone had been there either. When the doors flew open for a third night in a row, the man in the dark robe didn't make a second appearance. Since then, no one has come forward to claim that they were the ones behind this spookish prank, But a witness did claim to have seen a ghostly apparition of a large figure near those very same doors. Skeletor, as the spirit was dubbed, has not been caught on CCTV since, but many believe that the spirit was none other than Henry VIII himself, come to survey what has become of his once favourite residence. Stop what you're doing right now. Stop listening to the podcast. Stop. Go and look up that video. The link to the video is in the description of this episode. So there's a YouTube link in the description. Click on it, watch the video, go and enjoy it. Come back for further discussion about this video. Okay, hi, welcome back. I'm glad that you went and watched it. I adore this video, okay? I remember this video being discussed on like morning TV in the UK. I remember it and I just love it. It's so clear, and I know there are loads of people who have said this is clearly somebody in costume doing some sort of reenactment, or people who do tours of the palace or whatever, or workers in the palace that dress in historical costume closing the doors, right? I'm not believing that. I'm sorry, I'm refusing to believe it. I also don't think it's Henry VIII, though, to be really frank. I don't think it's Henry VIII. I don't think he'd be bothered about closing fire doors, to be honest. I think he'd be too busy thinking who he's going to, what wife he's going to slaughter next. That's what he'd be too busy thinking about. And apparently in the comments on YouTube, right, which obviously is where every good researcher and investigator gets their top class facts, true information, in the comments on YouTube, apparently workers do dress in period dress, or did at this time period anyway, in Hampton Court Palace, but they did not have access to that particular area. And it did not explain also how the doors burst open. Seemingly both doors burst open on their own, and that happened 3 consecutive nights. I know the figure was only seen one night, but it doesn't explain those things. And you can choose to believe that is somebody that is a worker in period dress, but I'm choosing to believe it is a ghost from that time period who is thinking, what the fuck's a fire door? So like I said, kind of at the beginning of this, if you are that person who works in Hampton Court Palace, I'm really sorry. I cannot find our conversations. And I would love to visit Hampton Court Palace and find out how much of these ghost stories are, true, in that they're not just legends that have been passed down over the years, but nobody's actually experienced them. We hear these stories about like a woman in white appears on this day, but nobody in living memory has actually experienced that. It's just a story that has been passed down. And I really found the story of Catherine Howard really, really difficult, right? Because, God, you can just imagine this 18-year-old girl is told, you've been accused of adultery, and she immediately knows, oh my God, that means I'm going to die. Like I am going to be put to death. I can't. This vision of her running, trying to get to Henry, who's in the chapel praying. He needs all the prayers he can get, but anyway. So she's trying to run to him, screaming, begging, being like, oh my God, please don't do this. That's the vision of that in my head makes me want to lie down and cry. Like at 18 years old, to know, oh my God, I'm going to die and there's nothing I can do about it. And the only thing I can do is try and get to this man and beg for my life. Oh, it just gives me the heebie-jeebies, honestly. And I really think, maybe people aren't seeing her ghost in living memory. Maybe people are, right? But even if they're not, I think that detail of that story is really important, because, we always think about Henry VIII and Henry VIII's wives, and there were 6 of them, and, we make rhymes about them, and but they were also real women, and they didn't have much choice. If the king wanted to marry you, the king wanted to marry you, the end. And for a lot of these women, that was like their only chance at sort of social survival and social climbing and being financially secure. And there was all sorts of weight to that, and they were real women. And this real woman, this child, this 18-year-old girl, would have gotten this news and been absolutely petrified, terrified, traumatized, knowing that she was going to die. And I just feel like, God, that level of sadness, that level of distress and trauma, like surely that has left a mark on the place, you know? And I just, God, imagine what you'd feel if you were walking along and you suddenly see and hear this girl, this teenage girl, sprinting through the haunted gallery, trying to get to the chapel, wailing. It just doesn't even bear thinking about. And I wonder if there is something about that residual energy that has, you know, that made those two women faint in the same place on the same tour on the same day. Like, that's mad. That's a weird coincidence, if that's a coincidence. I wonder if it's something about that residual energy of, you know, I am a woman who has married this man and I am now going to be killed because I have married this man and he's bored of me, you know, which is essentially what happened with Henry VIII and his wives. If anybody listening to this has seen the musical Six, you will be pleased to know that I do have the song House of Holbein stuck in my head the entire way through this little dissection of the story of Hampton Court Palace. And now it's going to be in your head. You're welcome. And you do sort of forget, right? I forget that in these palaces, in these castles, in these royal places, there were people that spent their whole working lives living there. Like, they dedicated their entire life to the crown, dedicated their entire life to being a servant in this house. Like Sybil Penn being a wet nurse for Prince Edward and looking after Princess Elizabeth and, you know, looking after the other kids. Like, that is her life, the end. That she lives in Hampton Court Palace. She is there. She is not going anywhere else. And she has dedicated everything to this man, essentially, and to looking after these children. And that is dedication. Like, that is blind, loyal dedication. And I know as well, it would have been, you know, you would have gotten money, you would have gotten, you know, a place to live, you would have had your servants' quarters, you would have been fed. I understand all of those things too. But it's still a huge undertaking. And it makes sense to me that these women would be coming back. It makes sense that, you know, this grey lady would be coming back because she dedicated her entire life to looking after these children. So maybe it is just stone tape theory. Maybe it is just, you know, moments in time being replayed in the palace. I would like to think that Catherine Howard is not, her spirit is not stuck there, reliving that moment for eternity. I would like to think that rather it was just such an emotionally charged moment that the palace absorbed it and replays it every so often when the time is right. You know, maybe that's a better way to think about it than to think of her as being stuck there, or to think of Sybil Penn being stuck there. And I can't believe that I've never been to Hampton Court Palace. I need to go. I need to visit. I need to have a scoot round and have a look around. English history is mad. You know, doing this podcast has taught me loads about English history, because I don't, you know, in Ireland we learn about Irish history, we learn about, like, you know, the world wars and stuff in secondary school, but you don't necessarily learn about English history in terms of the rise and fall of various monarchs. I don't know how to say that word. You know, it's not really something we engage with. So learning about English history is wild. And I've learned about a lot of English history from Tim. And it just blows my mind, honestly. Henry VIII was such a massive knob. What an absolute dickhead. I think that's my big takeaway from this episode. Henry VIII, prize dickhead. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. And if you have a story that you would like to share, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website at reallifeghostsstories.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you can get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
To make switching to the new Boost Mobile risk-free, we're offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
So why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Because you have nothing to lose. Boost Mobile is offering a 30-day money-back guarantee.
No, I asked why wouldn't you switch from Verizon or T-Mobile?
Oh.
Wouldn't.
Because you love wasting money as a way to punish yourself because your mother never showed you enough love as a child?
Whoa. Easy there.
Yeah.
Applies to online activations. Requires port in and auto pay. Customers activating in stores may be charged non-refundable activation fees.